Are tariffs an effective tool to achieve national security goals? How will they impact the U.S. economy, energy security, and our partnership with allies? I'm your host, Navin Girishanakar, president of the CSIS Economic Security and Technology Department, and today we talk to our senior experts on economics and energy, Bill Reinsch, Phil Luck, and Joseph Majkut, to unpack the Trump administration's use of tariffs to address the fentanyl crisis. Phil, Joseph, Bill, thanks for joining. Let's get started on what has actually happened with the use of the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. Phil, why don't you just take us through what has happened when the president announced it? What are the dimensions of these tariffs?
Yes, the president announced tariffs on Mexico and Canada of 25%, with a carve-out for some energy exports from Canada of 10%. Also announced tariffs on China of 10% as well, all of which under IEEPA, which is a law that gives the president broad economic course of levers to address national security threats or national emergencies that come predominantly from an external source. Mm-hmm. This was, of course, the reason he gave was the fentanyl crisis. So mm-hmm. the increase of both the production and distribution in Canada and in Mexico, and then, of course, migration as well. We saw earlier today that there's been some reprieve on the Mexican side. We still haven't seen what happens on the Canadian side, but these would have a very large economic effect if they went into place.
Right. So let's just a little more color on that. So
Sure.
The reprieve on the Mexican side is a deferment of a month or a pause until those tariffs go into effect.
Yes.
There's been some discussion with the president of Mexico on border security or troops on the border to deal with the fentanyl interdiction. So that's happening, and he's bought some time for negotiation. So I have that right. Is there anything else on that piece that we should be aware of?
I mean, that's my understanding, and things are moving quickly. That's my understanding on the Mexican side. We'll see what happens on the Canadian side. They've taken a different tact, of course, that they've sort of announced their retaliation that they'll take into place. And so if that goes forward, we'll see relatively large economic impacts on both sides of the northern border. Again, the thing that needs to be stressed here is that the North American economy is one integrated supply chain, right? We import an enormous amount of machinery and other things from Mexico. Those things are parts of automobiles that are manufactured across all three countries. Your average car will cross borders 6 or 7 times before it's completed. More than 30% of a car that's an export of Mexico, more than 30% of the value added was made by American workers in America. So this is like putting up a barrier between New Jersey and New York. Like, it's massively impactful.
So you started to get us into economic impacts. This is really good. So let's go to energy impacts as well. Mm-hmm. So Joseph, you've been looking at this very closely. Let's talk, Phil's talked about the energy carve-out, which is really like 10% instead of 25%. For Canadian energy sources, but tell us what this means in terms of its impacts in the U.S.
Of course. Now, the U.S. and Canada, like for a variety of other trade, have an incredibly deep energy trade relationship. And by and large, the U.S. is an importer of energy resources, particularly crude oil from Canada. Canada actually last summer reached a record level of imports in the United States, over 4 million barrels a day, multitudes larger than we get from OPEC nations. Widely misunderstood by the general population that Canada is our single largest source of oil imports. And I think you see in the reduced tariff rate on energy resources some consternation about the price impacts of these kinds of tariff actions. So at the 10% rate, we're looking at price increases, particularly in Midwest, for a variety of technical reasons that we can talk about, increases anywhere from 5 to 20 cents on a gallon of gasoline. It sits a little bit within the sort of normal range of variation. If you were up at that 25% level, you would see a doubling and a half of that level of price increase, most likely. That, on the oil side, I think in particular it's important to note, runs particularly opposite a lot of what we're hearing from the administration on its broader desires with respect to energy costs, which is that they go down. Clearly, they've made an assessment that the costs imposed by this action are worth the potential benefits in kind of political negotiations with Canada. Not my lane, so it's hard for me to evaluate that exactly. But it's pretty clear that should these tariffs be imposed and stay, we're going to see noticeable, but I would say not dramatic price increases in the United States.
Do you know if it's being tariffs are being applied to electricity imports?
I actually don't have a line
Somebody
of sight
asked
on
me
that.
about that.
Yeah, the electricity trade between the U.S. and Canada also favors imports into the United States. The volumes are much lower, however, so the economic impacts, I think, are going to be a lot less. The thing I would be more worried about in that context is any retaliation on the Canadian side if they decide to stop imports or make it harder to do imports into the United States. I think you could see some particularly bad regional effects, especially in the northeast of the United States.
So before we go there, let me just hang on this for a second,
Yeah,
Bill,
of course.
which is speak to the geographic impact because it's not uniform of, say, tariffs on Canadian oil. On
Sure.
crude.
So, I mean, the nature of the energy system is such that all these Canadian oil comes down into the United States, particularly into the Midwest where it's refined and sold to consumers. So it's sort of, you have in your mind this like very liquid, fluid marketplace, particularly in the global oil context. But in this context, you're talking a lot about pipelines.
Yeah.
And pipelines flow typically in one direction.
Yeah.
And we sort of optimize the midstream, the pipeline sector, and the downstream, the refinery sector, for where they can get fuels and where they can get fuels cheaply, reliably, and with high security. Now, the expectation up until recently has been that the U.S.-Canada energy trade is fairly secure and relatively non-volatile.
Yeah.
And so a lot of refineries, particularly in the Midwest, are designed to take the kind of oil that comes out of Canada, and the pipeline infrastructure has been set up such that they can receive that oil very fluidly, very easily. Now, you might say, well, the U.S. is also a huge producer, so what's the problem? We'll shift some things around, we'll reorient a little bit of infrastructure, and by and large, U.S. consumers will be fine. In the long term, that very well may be true, but that adjustment period is not 1 week. And for pipelines, especially if you have to reverse flow, it can take years to accomplish that project.
So this is the difference between speaking in the aggregate, which the president has mentioned, like we can produce enough, versus the geographic and the switching costs required for that.
Yeah. There's definite regional effects that we should anticipate seeing should these tariffs be enforced. And in particular, the Midwest. There's a little bit of fuel trade that goes from Western Canada by boat down into the Western United States. The volumes are much smaller. I'm sure for refinery operators there, it'll be very important, but on a sort of national or regional scale, it'll be less important than what we're going to see in the Midwest.
Bill.
So if the Canadians really wanted to retaliate, they would do an export tax on oil.
Yeah, or even an export restriction. I think the challenge there would be it's an incredibly important export piece of the Canadian export economy. And like Phil said, the size of the U.S. economy is so much larger. I think in an all-out trade war, the asymmetry would favor the United States.
It's been suggested that the Premier of Alberta is not very enthusiastic about that. So
Yeah, for understandable reasons.
Now, Bill, you've been writing and talking about the impact on the business environment, on the investment climate of these kinds of tariff measures and what that means for confidence, investor confidence. Talk to us about that.
yeah, I think it's going to be a negative. I'm surprised that if he's done it in order to, as he said on a number of occasions, to force companies to move here, and then he thinks that tariffs do that. I think that flies in the face of the way that investors think. In the work we've done looking at investors, private investors, looking for FDI, basically, the three big macro criteria that they employ are, is the country a rule of law country?
Right.
Is there policy stability? That is the policy next year likely to look pretty much like the policy this year? And three, is there a commercial dispute resolution system that is transparent, objective, and efficient? And basically what these tariffs do is they trash all three of those. They are sketchy as far as the law is concerned. They are arbitrary. They are, there's no guarantee of how long they'll last. I mean, the Mexican case is an example. It's, that announcement lasted from Friday night to Monday morning, and we'll see if the Canadian one sticks. If I were an investor, I think I would be thinking, particularly if I were contemplating a multi-million-dollar long-term investment in new facilities in the United States, I think long and hard about doing that in an era right now where we have extreme policy instability.
Well, you said it very nicely. The strategic unpredictability that has been touted from a negotiating point of view may not be very good from a investment attraction point of view.
Yes, exactly. It may be good from a negotiating point of view.
Yeah.
He thinks that works, but it's not. Yeah, it makes everybody hold on to their wallets.
Yeah. And it's interesting because when you see how this flows through to the financial markets, you could argue that the tariffs are stagflationary. They will cause an increase in prices. They may also cause at least a lower than expected growth. And so when you look at the traditional 60-40 portfolio of most institutional investors, at least for the moment, this can't be good for them. But obviously, these things get priced in and we'll see how they play out. Now, let me come back to the question of goals, because that's ultimately like at the core of this. Can tariffs be used to achieve certain goals, including non-economic goals? So in this case, it's clear that there is a non-economic goal that is being pursued. Let's come back to that. Previously, the president has said he also wants to use tariffs to raise revenues. He also wants to use it to address trade balance issues. So, Phil, I'm going to come back to you on this. Take each of these things. Let's take revenues, and then we'll come to trade balance issues. And Bill may want to jump in here as well. But what are the likelihoods? What's the likelihood of success?
Yeah, absolutely. And just on the one point that Bill made before that, there's a large, both theoretical and empirical economic literature that basically proves an obvious thing, which is in the case of uncertainty, businesses hate that, and there's an option value to waiting. They'll just wait on things, right? So that's an obvious thing. To the point about what are the goals here, I mean, you're exactly right. I mean, the president has laid this out. His secretary's nominee for Treasury and Commerce have laid this out. They claim revenue generation, they claim leverage, and they claim unfair trade practices, fixing those things. Where normally the thing they look at for untrade practices, at least the president, is some sort of bilateral trade deficit or surplus. So let's take all those in kind. Revenue, the U.S. government gets about 1.7% of total revenue from tariff revenue, right? It's a tiny piece of it. Estimates, and these are very back of the envelope estimates, to have a tariff rate that would just close the budget deficit, not even, just closing that deficit, and assuming no reduction in trade as a result of this tariff, and assuming no retaliation, and assuming no reduction in economic activity, you'd need a tariff rate on all goods from all countries higher than 50%, right? That would be massively impacting the U.S. economy. So none of those assumptions hold. So it's never been a large source of revenue as the U.S. has been a developed economy. That's true of basically all major developed economies. And economies that do rely more on tariffs for revenue, it has a expected effect of making your industry less competitive because they're not competing against international competitors and they're facing higher prices of inputs. So revenue, it's not a very good tool generally. I'll also add to that, the burden of tariffs generally fall on people who have a higher share of their income go to consumption. Those are lower income people, right? So it's a regressive tax on top of being a distortive tax. To the point of whether this can achieve sort of goals around trade policy. So, look, I think we have tariffs on the PRC. Some of those, the 301 tariffs, were instituted because of IP theft, right? That's a clear case of we using a trade instrument to try to change behavior of a partner country. They have not been very effective, and we've paid a lot of those tariffs. But that's a case where you can use that, and I think in some cases you can. We don't really have, for the most part, those issues with Canada and Mexico. We have some small issues, but certainly they're not being addressed by our current situation. The other thing I would note is if you're using the trade imbalance, the bilateral trade deficit, that's a really bad measure of a unbalanced trade relationship. I have a trade deficit with Costco because I buy things from Costco. Costco does not buy things from me. That has nothing to do with the fairness of our relationship, right? So that's the bilateral trade deficits are not a good measure.
Oh, you're raising a good, accurate point, a philosophical one with which the president and people in his administration would probably vociferously disagree. But let me take you here.
Yeah.
Let's just take it at face value,
Sure.
right? Which is that, tell me if I'm correct here. We impose tariffs on Canadian goods and on Mexican goods. Chances are we will see a rise in imports from other countries like Germany or others in Europe. In other words, you might solve the bilateral trade balance with those countries, but you won't solve it in the aggregate because our producers need those imports, right, as inputs to their production.
Yeah, absolutely. In some cases, that's the best case scenario for us in the sense that, look, when we saw tariffs on the PRC, in situations where there wasn't another place we could buy it from, we had to pay the entire tariff, right? Because they knew that it was only going to be produced in China, therefore they could just pass the whole cost on to us. You're exactly right.
Great point. Yeah.
So in the case of, in 2009, when President Obama put tariffs on the PRC tire industry, right? Because we argued that they were dumping into our market. We put tariffs on them. To your point, really what happened was we bought more tires from South Korea and Japan rather than the PRC. We did pay higher prices for those tariffs, so costs went up. We saved a few jobs, right? That's absolutely the case. We stopped a slide in the auto industry. But one point I want to make is any protection like that comes at enormous cost. If the estimates of the time showed that for every job saved, consumers paid about $1 million per job, right? That's, this is a problem where the benefits from this types of tariff policy can be very acute, narrow, but the costs are diffuse. Everyone paying quite a bit more for tires. It's hard to see in aggregate, but the costs are really quite enormous.
You raise a really interesting point around IP, and I think it's a parallel to fentanyl interdiction, which is the following, and I'd welcome your thoughts on this, which is that tariffs are stroke of the pen measures. But to know whether you're succeeding on fentanyl interdiction or on IP implementation, this has to be assessed through time. So then it raises questions on what's the threshold before you see tariffs come back. Like, there is an important set of questions here on the design of this quid pro quo arrangement. Do you have any thoughts on that, anyone? Maybe start with Bill.
I don't have any thoughts on that. Start with somebody else.
Do you disagree with what I'm saying?
As you were talking, I was thinking there's just one of the problems of these things is the inevitable time lag. I mean, you're right. The tariffs go into effect on the day he chooses, which could be the next day, or in this case, 2 days, 3 days later. And all the various compensatory tactics that are available can't possibly be done in that time period.
Yeah.
So there's always going to be a lag between the stick, if you will, and the remedy. I mean, there's a bunch of things companies can do. They can, American companies that, well, if you think about retaliation too, which we haven't talked about yet, but tariffs here go up. I mean, but the normal thing, if you're a Canadian company suddenly facing tariffs, you can, or if you're an American company that suddenly has discovered all this stuff all your parts have become more expensive, you can just eat it and move on and hope for the best, hope nobody notices. The most common thing to do is to try to find alternative sources. If the tariffs are targeted as opposed to on everybody, you just find non-Canadian, non-Mexican sources. Right. One of the ironies of this is in the automobile sector. If you are, say, a German automobile manufacturer that's assembling your cars in the United States, but you have a supply chain that includes Mexico, of which there are several, what you will probably do is stop taking your parts from Mexico and get them from Germany. Mm-hmm. That's not going to create more jobs in the United States. It just rearranges the deck chairs, if you will. And I think that's a common move. Trump's belief is that what you will do is move here. And move your production here. Greenfield or build, just enhance what you've already got if you're already here. And we already talked about that. I mean, investors
significant assumption.
Well, plus, even if you're going to do it, it takes years to do that.
I want to hit something that you raised. Let's talk retaliation, and let's also talk China. We've been talking about Mexico, Canada. We haven't talked about China. So first of all, let's hit China. What is the likely impact of the tariffs on Chinese goods, both for U.S. consumers and producers? And then let's move to the retaliation point. So anyone, you want to hit China?
Sure, yeah. I mean, look.
I mean the China point.
Yeah. we saw a version of this but under Trump 1 and under the Biden administration. You know, the record shows we paid the vast majority of the tariffs that we put on China. Now, these are broad-based. This might be slightly different, but I don't expect that to be very different. Now, over time, we did see some reduction in our imports from China, but that resulted in increased imports from Southeast Asia and Mexico, a lot of which was Chinese firms setting up facilities in other countries. You know, they've seen this sort of move towards protectionism over the last 8 or so years, and they're much more prepared than they were last time. They also have a better toolkit, to your point about retaliation. They've got a better toolkit for retaliating, right? They have a much more developed export control regime, right? We depend on them for a lot of critical minerals, gallium, germanium, a host of graphite, a host of others. And so in addition to just buying less soybeans, which they did last time, they could put some pretty significant harm on our economy. The other point I want to make about retaliation, which connects to revenue, even I said that it's not a good source of revenue, but I have to admit it does bring in revenue, right? In the first Trump trade war, about 92% of every dollar we brought in revenue, we paid right back out to farmers to bail them out for retaliation, as a result of retaliation. So that's just another aspect of this challenge.
Yeah, the price elasticity of all of these goods has to be looked at when you're thinking about the impact of tariffs, which I know you and your colleagues would be looking at. Let's come back to retaliation, because I want to shift back to China, to Canada for a second. It has been suggested, and I heard at least one politician in Canada talk about, you talk about the germanium and gallium. I've heard some Canadian politicians talk about critical minerals as a choke point that they would use. I think of uranium, for example. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I actually looked it up, Bill, while we were talking. Not clear to me that this applies to electricity, but definitely would apply to critical minerals. One of the, this administration is looking at energy resources as including anything from oil and gas products to refined products to critical minerals.
Yeah.
U.S., Canada, critical mineral trade is fairly large, particularly uranium, nickel, a few others. In fact, higher trade volumes than we have with China on those goods when you measure the sort of the raw material. It's hard to know what to say about it other than this is going to increase the cost. Do we have the ability to adjust our production and adjust our supply chains? Sure. Could some of that be produced in the United States, and is that part of the Trump administration's long-term goal via permitting reform and a variety of other interventions? Absolutely. But the question is, I think for me, and I pose this to the table if I may, a little bit, how much is this weather versus this climate, to borrow an analogy from my background, right? So there's an immediate thing that the Trump administration wants to address, fentanyl issues.
Right.
This is a new sort of tool that we don't have a good muscle memory for, which is using tariffs to accomplish other political goals, not something the U.S. has done for a long time. And so I guess my question is for the group, how much is this just going to be sort of the order of the next few years versus are we in a sort of secular moment where we should just expect larger tariffs on a variety of products as part of this agenda?
That's a really interesting question, and I think it depends a little bit on the extent to which Congress decides to assert itself. This is a kind of a major intrusion into what I think the Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, assigns to the Congress authority to make these decisions. If Congress has delegated over the years, this is not just delegating, it's sort of seizing it. There's not an early sign that anybody's going to stand up to him on this issue.
Right.
And I think nobody will unless and until they start hearing from folks back home that prices have gone up or there's shortages or people are being laid off because they can't get parts and components and the factory has to shut down temporarily. Those are all possibilities. But until that happens, I think he gets away with it, and the question is this, weather or climate?
Right.
I mean, the Republican Party seems to have shifted in his direction on this. That's a big change. I mean, the Republicans historically have been the party, since 1950 or 52, have been the party of international free trade
Yeah.
and international connection. And now they're not. Will they revert when he leaves the scene? I don't know.
If there are people who remember what that was. So here's the thing.
I was alive.
Let me tell you, what's really interesting is a question that I have to answer your point. I thought it was a great question. Is what lesson will the administration learn from each one of these incidents? So, for example, in the Colombia instance, which was a week ago, that would have been viewed as, at least it was presented as a success. The tariff leverage worked as a success. In the case of Mexico, I think from the 10,000 people on the border, it's possible that they'll say, okay, that was a success.
Right.
Now, these are countries that really are not in a position to leverage much. They're kind of on the back foot. But Canada might have alternatives, and it remains to be seen how that plays out and what lessons are learned there. If the lesson again and again is the tariff bludgeon worked to achieve non-economic ends, then I think we're in the secular moment.
Right.
And if there's no one challenging. And so that brings me to the last thing I wanted to ask all of you, which is the impact on partnerships. Canada is about to take over the G7 presidency, is that right? Yeah?
They are
Coming up,
right
yeah.
now. Yeah.
And we need to orchestrate technology and partnership alliances to address, the United States, I should say, needs to orchestrate these alliances to address the bigger question, which is the tech competition with China.
Right.
And you need Canada, you need others. And so the question I would have is, how do you see the impact of these types of engagements, these types of potential trade wars on alliances, which we need?
Long-term disaster, I think. It's a major squandering of soft power. I mean, the countries that have been attacked so far are friends and allies. Canada, I mean, longest peaceful border in the world, in history, and they're annoyed. You read the stories about, booing the national anthem, and taking all American liquor out of the liquor stores and things like that. I mean, we're just, America has been, I think, remarkably effective over the years in soft power, in helping other countries grow and develop, and in return, hopefully getting them to cooperate with us on the various things that we think are important. If you irritate all of our friends and allies, who are you going to rely on? You can't rely on the Chinese to help us out. We used to be able to rely on the Canadians to help us out. And I think what you're going to see is, just as companies are de-risking from China, countries are going to de-risk from the United States.
Yeah.
I think a couple things are important to note here. One, that because as you say, the depth of this relationship is so strong, our security entanglements, our human entanglements, right? I've got Canadian kin and family and all that. You might expect these relationships to be slightly more stable. The question is how much does waving the tariff flag kind of allow for rearrangement, right? I will note, and one of the perils of doing live broadcasting is a 30-day pause on the implementation on the tariffs of Canadian imports was announced about 10 minutes ago. And so, a lot of what we've talked about are the stakes. I don't think this issue is going away. But on the question of, what is the political power that the Trump administration is going to be able to leverage out of threatening tariffs, it's pretty clear they're going to get concessions both out of Mexico and now likely Canada.
The whole thing always ends up being played as a victory.
Right.
Trump will claim victory.
Right.
He will claim victory against the Canadians, claim victory against the Mexicans. Whether or not they actually gave him anything doesn't really matter. The brilliant other party, the brilliant adversary, structures the outcome so it looks like Trump won.
Right.
And victory is if you get him to think he won and you didn't give him anything.
Right.
And we'll see, how that plays out.
Yeah, and just to back to Joseph's excellent analogy there, I think to put those the weather versus climate in terms of an economist to understand, to me is this just coercion or industrial policy, right? Like if he really is intent on having high tariffs on all countries, that's an industrial policy strategy. It's not one that's WTO consistent. It's not one that I think is in best interest of the United States. But that's a policy for reshaping the U.S. economy. It seems like with this announcement recently, it seems much more like he's just using this in a coercive way. And to Bill's point, those two goals are at odds, right? If you want to have an industrial policy view of things, you want stable tariffs. Maybe they're high if that's what you want to reindustrialize, but you need to give the investment community uncertainty about that. But
Exactly.
what he wants is to have these be really agile. I guess that's good for bullying your partners and allies, but it's very bad for any sort of industrial strategy. And to your point about, it's entirely possible that they're seeing these as wins. I will just say that, in my previous career, when I worked at the State Department, we worked with countries dealing with this from other countries bullying them. And, some of them backed down, some of them stood firm, but each one of them, that episode drastically changed how they thought about that bully. And so I would hope that the administration can see that you might win things in the short run. You might be able to get, concessions or a few more troops on a border or a new dialogue. But the long-term cost of this type of behavior is really, we'll find out how big it is, but I think it's pretty big.
Unless you're committed to it, unless it really is part of an industrial strategy where we're going to compensate losers in the United States, we're going to change the supply side so that we can meet that. And that's
Sure,
sort of a
but-
different, longer cycle issue.
Yeah, but then we'd have to see, I think the policy, what we'd see from the administration would be different from what we're seeing right now.
My sense is that there are always different paths to achieve a particular goal. And the question is this the most effective path to achieve the goal of better fentanyl interdiction on the border? We should see and we should assess this.
We'll know in 30 days.
Well, and in 30 days, we can write some more commentaries and maybe do this again. But, so with that, I want to thank my friends here, my colleagues, and thank you for joining the audience. Thank you for joining this really quite interesting conversation on tariffs and its impact on national security. You can listen to this conversation and more on CSIS.org and YouTube. This is Navin Girishankar reminding you that growth and security go together. Thank you very much.